Hello there, ATS EVS 105 students. Dr. John Schragi here. And I decided it is just a gorgeous day out here. We got a fresh coat of snow. I got to at least try to record out here. It's beautiful, and I've never actually tried to record in the snow before, so I thought I'd give it a shot. Also, part of the story is the schools are closed today, and it's a madhouse in my house. The kids are tearing the place apart. So let's try it outside anyway. Alright, so this is going to be the first of a series of lectures that we're going to have in this semester. That's kind of a broad theme about how the scientific method works. Now, I know even like in grade school you had some things where you learned about the scientific method and you had science fairs and stuff like that. But we're going to be learning about it in more structured way, more detailed, etc. And the first step of the scientific method that we're going to be learning about in this module is going to be about researching a question. Now, there's going to be 4 lectures over the course of the semester in different modules about this idea. Today, though, we're just going to be talking about how you set up the kinds of questions that a researcher is going to want to get an answer to. Now, this in and of itself is a tricky thing. I mean, in order to come up with a research question that's meaningful and worth spending your time on, the first thing is it's going to take a lot of education. You're going to need to know a great deal about the field before you can even ask a really good question. Don't get me wrong. If you're not an expert in chemistry, if you're not an expert in biology, that doesn't mean you can't ask great questions about biology or chemistry or whatever, but you probably can't ask the kind of questions that like a researcher is going to be spending time and research dollars and hiring staff to help with and so on. It's going to take a lot of specialized education in the field because all of the easy questions have already been answered. You don't have to be, I'm not trying to say you have to be the leading mind in science today. You don't have to be Stephen Hawking or a generation or two ago Albert Einstein, or go farther back, you don't have to be Charles Darwin or something to somehow be the only people who can answer questions or write questions or whatever in science. I mean, science is done every day by people just like you and me who have spent a long time learning about the discipline. Those people in that picture I just showed you, those researchers, will have spent a long time learning about their discipline and the kinds of questions that get answered and the tools that they use and so on. They'll have had a very long history of college courses that they've taken with homeworks and reports and so on. They'll have done readings, they'll have read more or less all of the key books in their field. They'll have attended seminars where they've gotten to see ideas take shape and get feedback and so on. They'll have written reports, they'll have taken independent study classes, they'll have written, just like classic reports in classes, they'll have been engaged in discussions, they'll have gone off to conferences and seen what ideas work and which ones don't. They'll have had successes, they'll have had failures. It's not something you can fake. Okay? A long history of having been involved in a formal education about your discipline is pretty much a prerequisite for being able to form meaningful questions that you actually do experiments on. That is actually what is fundamentally different between what like a scientist does and say a kid at a science fair. I mean, here's some kids, getting to meet the president with at their White House science fair, and the kids saying, "Hey, we're learning the scientific method here." And I don't know why I made the president mean here, but I guess that's a type of scientific experiment. I mean, I guess these kinds of things that kids do, well, they sort of illustrate how the science works and so on, but this isn't really what scientists do, kids. It's not very good. Okay, I mean, let me show you, give you an example here. Every little kid's at some point done the baking soda and vinegar volcano here, okay, where they make a little little science experiment or whatever with that. And here's a happy father experimenting on making a little lava flow with his, looks like about a 6-year-old kid right there. And the kid's just happy as can be, and the dad is happy as can be. But they aren't really learning anything about how a volcano works. Volcanoes have nothing whatsoever to do with baking soda and vinegar. It's just kind of a fun thing. At best, maybe they're learning a little bit about chemistry or something like that, but I don't buy for a minute that 6-year-old there is learning anything about chemistry. He's just thinking, cool, now where can we get a whole truckload of that white baking soda and a whole and a ginormous tank of the vinegar, the stinky stuff, and could a Ninja Turtle stop such an eruption and so on? I mean, the kids aren't learning anything about volcanoes or chemistry when they're doing these kinds of experiments, and the happy father is like, yeah, I'll get on that right away, right? Excuse me, I've got little kids, and they love to do what they think of as science experiments, and most of them are basically just pouring crap together, okay? But you still encourage it. I mean, it's a step towards becoming a scientist someday, if that's what they choose to do. So the researcher has to be able to work on questions that are more refined, that are more specific than what the kids at like the science fair are doing. Okay, when the kids at the science fair are just trying to grow a bigger pumpkin, or they're just trying to make a bigger volcano or whatever, they're just playing. The researcher is not playing, although that can happen. Researchers love to play with data in what's really, frankly, not that different from what a kid is doing at a science fair. I mean, I fully confess that I am not an expert, like as in I do research and so on the subject of climate change. It's just not the particular specialty that I have. But, you know, if I wanted to do some research on climate change, you know, I can download the data sets with global climate data, and, you know, I could get the access to the information about, like, the rates at which glaciers are melting and things like that. But what I would be doing, you know, and I mean, it would be kind of fun to make some graphs, and for teaching purposes, that could be really useful. We have labs in like the ATS 113 class where we're effectively doing that. We're downloading some data sets and, you know, plotting the temperature trends and so on, and that's neat, but that is basically just playing. I mean, for me, with my background is more specifically in more like meteorology, and we'll learn more about that in just a few minutes. When I'm interested in something about global change or whatever, it would make more sense for me to read about what experts are doing. It doesn't really make a whole lot of sense for me to try to spend years suddenly becoming an expert on the subject of, you know, modern research in climate change so that I could be right up there with the bigwigs and so on. That's just not a good use of my time. Doesn't mean that, like, for teaching purposes it isn't fun or useful. I mean, if I play around with some global temperature data sets or some data sets about ice pack or something like that, it's fun, it's intellectually stimulating and so on, but basically I'm just doing the same kind of things the kids at the science fair are doing. That's not my expertise, okay? That being said, I mean, good grief, I've done this a long time. I do have a PhD in atmospheric sciences. I've went to college for 10 years for it. I have about 70 credit hours explicitly in atmospheric science courses and in meteorology, climatology type courses. I have a degree in statistics as well. I can't imagine that there's nothing I could do that would be interesting about climate change. I would just need to come up with a better question than, like, is the planet getting warmer? That's a great question, and at my level, that would basically just be playing. I don't know enough about the global climate system to be an expert and actually do meaningful research on that subject. So let's think about the kinds of things I could do with my background. Now, as I think I've mentioned before, my background is actually African meteorology, okay? It's a long story as to why I decided to go into African meteorology. It has a whole thing to do with personal mission for people who are living in marginal areas and all that. But more importantly, though, I mean, that's what I have spent a lot of time doing. I have a lot of expertise on the subject of the meteorology and climate of Africa. And, you know, perhaps I would want to do some kind of research about the way, say, climate change would be affecting West Africa. Okay, this is something that I could be involved in. I could see how I could come up with research questions, and since the purpose of this lecture is to talk about how a scientist would come up with research questions to do as part of the scientific method, let's think about the kinds of things I would come up with, okay? So, I mean, I could think of questions that were about things like, how will climate change, anthropogenic climate change caused by people, how would that change maybe the temperatures in Africa, or the precipitation that they would get, or so on. And, I mean, I know a lot about that part of the world, as it happens. I know a lot about the instruments that are located there, where are the weather stations, how long those stations have been operating, the limitations of what they can and can't do. I have a lot of colleagues and contacts in West Africa. I would be able to get a hold of the people who would know things if I didn't know the answers to certain questions. Okay, we're getting closer to the kind of, I mean, if, again, we're talking about the scientific method here, what could I come up with as a question about climate change? Okay, well, I've got plenty of questions, actually. I'm going to use that abbreviation GHG for greenhouse gases here, just because it wouldn't all fit on the screen here. But, you know, like if anthropogenic release of greenhouse gases were to increase, were to continue to increase, I have lots of good questions. I mean, I'd like to know how that would affect the climate of West Africa. That would actually be something I would very much like to know the answer to, and I could be involved in research about something like that. What do these changes mean for the conditions that contribute to droughts or famines or the spread of certain tropical diseases? I'd love to know that. That's a big part of the reason why I went into this field, is I want to know about things like droughts and famines. Some tropical diseases are spread, or the spread of them is related to changes in climate. I've been involved, for example, in projects that were about climate change and malaria. How will, under different climate regimes, how will the spread of malaria change because of like changes in mosquito habitats and so on? Some types of encephalitis are easier to spread if it's dustier. Okay, dust kind of causes micro damage to your lung cells that makes it easier for the bacteria to pass through your lungs and into your body. That's fascinating. I would love to know more about that. Is the effect uniform, or will it be regional? As the planet gets warmer, maybe some parts of Africa will get warmer, will increase their temperature more than others. Or will get more rainfall than others, or something. That seems interesting. I would love to know the answer to that. How sensitive are these future climate outcomes to changes we could be making now? Are we locked into a certain amount of temperature increase, or could, by making certain changes, could we mitigate climate change? I'd love to know the answers. These are all great questions. And they're cool questions, but they're pretty broad questions, okay? These would not be simple questions to answer for like a single person running an experiment. These are more like the kinds of questions the whole discipline of like African meteorology and African climate and climate change would be addressing. It's like a career. You would spend your career working on these kinds of questions. That's important, okay? Knowing like broadly the kinds of things you're going to be working on is important. But it's not the same thing as like, how am I designing this experiment for the scientific method or whatever. It's not, these questions are too broad. Let's see if we can narrow them down a little bit. I'll just pick that first one about how will, as greenhouse gases continue to increase, how will this affect the climate of West Africa? That's a ridiculously broad question. You could make your whole career studying how climate change is going to affect West Africa. It's important, but it's just way too broad. So let's instead say, well, what would Dr. Shragi, how would he narrow the question further so that he could like design an experiment? All right, well, let's talk about rain. Rain in West Africa. Rain in West Africa comes from the West African monsoon. The monsoon is a topic I'm hugely excited about, and I would love to tell you all about. Feel free to take ATS 553 Tropical Meteorology and learn all about it. I will tell you about it for like a month. But the West African monsoon is just basically this idea that the southern coast of West Africa has a dry season and a wet season. So like in January there, you can see if it's red, they're getting no rain at all. And these are data that show like a 30-year period how much rainfall they got in January versus how much they get during the peak of the rainy season, which is August. And you can see that there is a very large difference. Like if I just sort of blink back and forth between these this box here, you can see how it goes from basically no precipitation in the dry season to a very large amount of precipitation in the wet season. Over the course of the few months of the summer monsoon, those parts of the world get literally meters of rain. Just, for comparison, Omaha gets about 30 inches of rain per year. That's not quite 1 meter. They get meters of rain just in the summer in, parts of West Africa. And the West African monsoon is part of the climate system, and in fact the West African monsoon primarily happens because of differences in the temperatures between continents and the ocean around the continents, which I'm illustrating with these plots right here, where you can see that in January the Sahara Desert is actually a lot colder than the surrounding oceans, whereas in the summer, when the sun is really beaten down on the sands of the desert is much warmer than the surrounding oceans. It's this change between the continent's temperature and the difference between the continent's temperature and the ocean's temperature that drives that monsoon that causes these huge changes in precipitation. This contrast between the ocean's temperature and the land's temperature drives the flow of air at the surface from the ocean towards the land, and it brings moisture with it. Maybe this slightly more technical looking diagram here might help you see how the flow comes from the Atlantic Ocean onto the continent, and it brings all this moisture, and that becomes the rain of the West African monsoon. Well, it's not terribly hard to see how climate change could screw all that up. I mean, by changing temperatures, we're going to have to know, is the ocean warming more, or is the land warming more? Is it warming more in summer, or is it warming more in winter? Things like that, but you could see how you could really mess up the contrast of the temperatures between the ocean and land, which then could change the monsoon. And that would, of course, affect very much the people who live there, because they live in a very marginal climate zone. They have barely enough rain to make it through, some places get tons of rain during the wet season, but some places get less and less and less until you get up by the Sahara, where they get basically no rain at all. you want to make sure that there is not going to be big changes in the precipitation. So, like, if I took a very broad question, like, how will anthropogenic climate change affect West Africa? A better, more focused question would be, how will anthropogenic climate change affect the distribution of precipitation in the West African monsoon? Okay, now, that starts sounding awfully specialized, but you need to have an awfully specialized question so that you can really understand and get a handle on one chunk of a big, complicated problem. This is definitely a better research question. But it's still a pretty broad research question. So let's kind of see if we can focus this in even a little bit further. Okay, I've been talking about the West African monsoon and its rain like it's a thing. But just like any other part of the world, I mean, it isn't like the rain turns on and the rain turns off. There's storms. And there's lots of different types of storms. I mean, there's lots of different types of storms in Omaha, and there's lots of different types of storms in West Africa. So let's talk about some of the kinds of storms that they have in West Africa. Some storms are going to be, as we can see on these satellite images here, they're going to be thunderstorms that happen right along the coast each day of the wet season that are caused by what we call the sea breeze. Okay, that's one type of storm. If you live near the coast, you can have sea breeze thunderstorms that pop up each afternoon right along the coast. For that matter, there are these so-called afternoon instability showers that pop up in West Africa over any place where there's like an isolated high mountain peak or high plateau or something like that. These little showers just sort of pop up each day, and that's another type of precipitation that is not that closely related to what's going on in the sea breeze thunderstorms. Another type of thunderstorm that they have are what are called MCSs. These are mesoscale convective systems. As it happens, we have them in Nebraska as well, although they're somewhat different than what they see in Africa, but they're closely related. And there are these big clusters of thunderstorms that swoop across the continent, especially at night. Okay, they're, for all intents and purposes, completely unrelated to those multi-cell thunderstorms that were popping up during the day, or those sea breeze thunderstorms. That's indifferent. I mean, what will be causing more of the MCSs is going to be different than the ones that, what's going to cause more of the sea breeze thunderstorms or whatever. Then there's the granddaddy of them all. There's a particularly violent kind of thunderstorm in West Africa called a West African squall line. These are really violent, windy storms that happen especially farther north, almost on the fringe of the Sahara Desert. They get these really vicious thunderstorms that have this big gust front of strong winds out ahead of them, and they dump heavy rain right on the edge of the Sahara Desert. They, in fact, bring basically all the rain that part of the world ever gets. And when these squall lines move out over the Atlantic Ocean, they can be what grows into a hurricane. Oh, now wait a minute. West African squall lines sound pretty cool. It sounds like there's a whole lot to learn about those guys. Well, maybe as the world changes, as climate change happens and the world gets warmer, maybe these West African squall lines will get stronger. Maybe they'll get weaker. Maybe they'll last longer. I mean, right now they last about 12 hours on average. Maybe they'll last longer and cover more area. Maybe they'll last less time and cover less area. That all sounds really important if you live there. Okay? It sounds really important if, like, getting them all the way to the coastline so they can turn into a hurricane and affect North America is important. Holy smokes. These things, that's some tough questions. What if these West African squall lines shift? Like, what parts of the world they happen? Maybe they shift a little bit farther to the north, and now that rain is falling over the Sahara Desert. Or what if it shifts a little south, and now it's falling over the jungles along the coast of West Africa? Holy smokes, there's all kinds of ways these guys could get messed up. So if I wanted to take these research questions that I've been talking about and get even more focused, how about the bottom one here? How will climate change affect the distribution of West African squall lines, like where they're going to occur and how long they last and stuff like that? Now that is a research question I can get behind. I have connections. I could work on that particular question here. So if I were going to be taking and, thinking about the scientific method, and I was trying to come up with an experiment I'd want, and the first thing I'd want to do is start researching the question. And my question was, how will climate change affect the distribution of these West African squall lines? Before I get too sold on this project, though, I need to ask myself what work has already been done on this, because it makes no sense whatsoever for me to duplicate what some other researcher at some other university has already done. That's a waste of my time and resources and so on. How do I find out about that? Well, the first thing I would do is I'd read some scientific journals. Now, later in the semester, we're going to learn all about scientific journals and the publication process and what kind of information is in there. But this is where scientists report their work. And I'm showing you here some video that was taken by my student Bayu Rizanto. I asked him to go up to the library and just take some video of where the journals are and so on. In practice, these days, scientists don't tend to go to the library and actually dig through paper journals. These things are all available in various formats online and are searchable and all that kind of stuff. But I would spend a lot of time researching the background of who is doing work on this kind of stuff, what questions have they already answered, because it makes no sense to have a duplication of effort. If somebody's already answered a question, I'm much better off adjusting my question to come up with ways to learn more about what they have already taught us. I'd also talk to colleagues. Okay, I would be starting a new project about how climate change affects the distribution of West African squall lines. Well, I probably would want to talk to my colleagues because they might know things I don't know. You know, I've got colleagues at universities in Germany who do lots of work about West African squall lines, and, you know, maybe they'd know, hey, don't you know that French team's already done that study about climate change in West African squall lines? That would be something I would need to know. I would like to go to conferences where presenters give talks about their research. You need to talk to people and find out what's already going on. Another thing I'd want to make sure is that the tools exist to do the work I want to do. Do we have data? Like if this is a climate change type study, I'm not going to like say, well, I guess I'll go set a weather station up where these squall lines happen and wait for 40 years and see if the squall lines going past my station changed. I'm going to want to go out there and get weather observations that already exist and work with them and see how the weather observations that already exist are showing if there's been a change, in this case, in my West African squall lines. Well, what data sets already exist, then, is something I need to research before I get my heart set on this question. Let me just give you an example here about West Africa. Here's a map that shows where weather stations are in West Africa. Any place that has that sort of little ball and stick symbol there is a place where they launch weather balloons, which have instruments on them that measure, you know, the temperature, pressure, winds, etc. as the balloons fly up. They do that twice a day at each of those locations there. And there's other weather stations and buoys and stuff marked on there and so on. Is this enough? I mean, these are... It looks like there's quite a few little weather stations on there and so on, but this is few and far between compared to, say, North America. If I wanted to study the weather of the United States, I'd be laughing that there's so few weather observations in Africa. All right, well, if I wanted to study the changes in West African squall lines, well, these weather stations are pretty far apart. I mean, spatially, are they at a high enough resolution? Or, like, will the whole squall line happen between two stations and I don't have any observations that happened where the squall line was? That's a good question to know the answer of before you get your heart set on this project. Are these observations at a high enough temporal resolution? Most weather stations launch their balloon every 12 hours. But some it's once a day. Well, a squall line only lasts about 12 hours. I mean, the whole squall line could form, go through its life cycle, and disappear between one observation and the next one, and we didn't get any observations of the squall line. Are these observations good enough to do the work that we're going to need to have done? Is their period of record long enough? A lot of these weather stations weren't even established until about the mid-2000s. About 2005 or so is when a lot of these weather stations got set up in Africa. So I might only have, you know, a decade or so of data from some of these stations. Am I going to be able to tell any kind of climate change from only one decade of observations at these stations? You know, whereas maybe some other stations have been launching weather balloons for 100 years. Okay, I think I'm a whole lot more likely to see climate change impacts if I have 100 years of data than if I only have, say, 10 years of data. Okay, I have to find out what's available at these weather stations and make sure I've got the data and the tools I need in order to study the phenomenon I want to study. For that matter, do they measure the quantities I need? I mean, weather balloons measure things like temperature, pressure, wind, and so on. Great. But if I think I need some other information, like maybe the size of the droplets in the West African squall line, well, weather balloons don't measure that. Okay? So this doesn't do me any good. You know, they don't measure rain rate as the balloon flies, for example. There's other properties they do and don't measure. If they don't measure the things I need, this is a bad research question. Well, I mean, it's still a good question. I just can't answer it because I don't have the access to the kind of data it's going to take to answer the question. Are these measurements accurate enough? If I need my data to be accurate to, temperature data to be accurate to at least 1/10 of a degree Celsius in order to know if the changes are happening and they only measure it to a degree, this isn't good enough. I wouldn't be able to do it. This happened to me, oh man, I came up with a really great project a couple years ago that was going to be involving humidity data, and I couldn't make it work despite the fact the equations were just fine. The data never worked quite right, and I eventually found out that they weren't measuring the humidity very accurately, you know. It was kind of just a ballpark estimate of the humidity rather than like accurate to the nearest, you know, 1% or something like that. Oh, no wonder my stuff wouldn't work. The data weren't accurate enough. I had invested a whole bunch of effort in that question and then found out I should have looked into that first. Actual physical observations taken on the ground or by weather balloons, these so-called in situ observations, we'll learn more about that term later in the semester, are one way we could measure, be studying this. Maybe another is to use satellites. That's called remote sensing, but again, that's a term we'll learn later in the semester. Well, satellites are a great source of information, but they also have problems. For example, notice that these satellites are in these crazy orbits, these so-called polar orbits and so on. Well, they all cross different locations at different times. I mean, if I know that there's a particular West African squall line moving across the nation of Burkina Faso on July 10th of some year, 2012 or something, take a look at these satellites. What are the odds that one of these research satellites just happened to be above that squall line at that given time? Okay, the timing of these satellites is not so good. Some of the satellites have better resolution, some of them have worse resolution, some of them have the right kinds of cameras and instruments and sensors on board, others are used for different purposes. Even if the satellite was there, it may not have the instrument I need to study, you know, the sizes of the raindrops in these storms. Satellites can do more than just take pictures of the clouds. They have ways that they can make measurements of things inside the cloud, like the humidity or the drop sizes or whatever. For that matter, a big problem with satellites is a lot of these satellites don't fly all that long. Would you have a long enough period of record to be able to measure climate change when that satellite maybe only flew for 5 years? Okay, this could be a real problem if you're trying to use satellite data to understand climate change. Now, another idea, another tool that scientists use when they're studying climate change are what are called climate models. Now, we're going to have a whole module about climate models in a couple of weeks. For right now, it's enough to know that a climate model is a computer program that can simulate the climate so that you can do experiments and see if I change this, how would the climate change, and so on. Okay, so I have some example of a picture here about climate change from a model. But, you know, models are human creations, and they have limitations. Will this model necessarily be simulating the West African squall lines correctly? Are they producing forecasts that are accurate enough? Climate models are a huge computer program that takes very large supercomputers to run. Do I have the skills or the expertise to run the model? If I get my heart set on some research, but then I can't make the model run because I don't know enough about supercomputers, that's a problem. It's a great research question, but I don't have the right tools to solve it. Well, these are all things we gotta, before we get you know the scientific method. We're gonna design an experiment, we're gonna test our hypothesis, we're gonna publish our results, all that. But before we get to any of that, we gotta know what our question is. Now, if I think I've come up with a question that is important and hasn't already been answered by somebody else and is of the right size, it's a manageable scope, I can actually answer this question, and I believe that I have the data or the tools or whatever that can answer the question, then maybe I have actually gotten through the first step of the scientific method. I have researched a question, and I'm ready to start doing things like constructing a hypothesis and testing my hypothesis and so on. Great. All right, well, I hope I kind of helped you understand what was going on. The neighbor kids are out there having a snowball fight now, so I think I'll call that the end of the video. And please let me know if you have any questions about this first step of the scientific method. This has been Dr. John Schrage.